Hi, welcome to the House of Glare recording studio. And on this recording, hopefully we can finish our discussion of fiscal policies. And hopefully by the end of our discussion, we'll have a pretty good knowledge of what it is, how they're applied, what their impact is, and some of the problems involved in fiscal policies. Now, fiscal policies are the function of the federal government generally in terms of the economy. And so, one thing I didn't mention in a previous recording that maybe I should have is that there is a lot of sentiment out there which has the opinion that government is too large in terms of helping an economy to be optimum or reach its potential. And there is some support for that in the numbers. For instance, corporate profits as a part of GDP remained at about 9%. Okay, and they've been that way for quite a while. The government portion of GDP has been up and down, but it's been expanding for the last 10 years or so. And that is between 19 and 21%. Okay. And in terms of the national debt, which is the sum total of government deficits minus the few surpluses we've had, mostly in the mid to late 90s, as a percentage of GDP, our national debt in the United States runs at about 102% of GDP. Now that's pretty substantial. Japan, on the other hand, is at over 120%. But that is substantial. Now, is the national debt a bad thing necessarily at all times? No, because the government, in terms of the Great Depression, the New Deal, the government didn't have many sources of revenue in terms of taxation and things like that. So the government had to borrow to get the economy going again. And that in World War II got the economy going again. But anyway, on this particular recording, I thought we would first of all start out by what is the full impact of a fiscal policy on the economy. Okay. Well, a fiscal policy, we know that GDP equals consumption plus net investment plus government plus net exports, okay? Well, the fiscal policy generally is this component, G, increasing in some way. Let's say in our example, there is a tax rebate. Say the government gives everybody or selected people or somebody a tax rebate, okay? They do that to try to increase aggregate demand. And aggregate demand, of course, the biggest part of that is consumption. So let's say $1 billion went into consumption, okay? Or went into the economy here through an increase in the government component. So how would aggregate demand, what would be the full impact? Would it be the 20, whatever the percentage change or growth in aggregate demand would be that corresponded to the, what did I say, the $1 billion injected into the economy? Well, no. It would be different than that because the biggest part is consumption, of course, but not all money that is earned is consumed. some is saved. Okay. And the saved goes into, is lent out, and it goes into the system again. So just like the fact that there is a deposit multiplier for when you put $1,000 into a checking account, it creates more than just $1,000 in the money supply, because the excess reserves of that for that figure can be lent out, and the multiplier of that is actually 1 over the required reserve ratio. Okay, so if 10% is the required reserve ratio, the multiplier is 10. So that $1,000 will eventually make $10,000 as an addition to the money supply. Okay, the same thing sort of goes with GDP, with an injection by a fiscal policy. Okay. So let's figure out what the multiplier is. Well, for every dollar, this is the way that that economists define what we do with each dollar, with the money that we receive, how we handle it. Okay, economists have defined what is called the marginal propensity to consume. Okay, and what that means is for every $1 we get, what percentage of that dollar do we go out and spend? Okay, so if and marginal, that's what marginal propensity to consume is. Marginal, additional dollar. Propensity, that's just a $1.50 word, fancy word meaning practice or tendency. And you know what consumption is. Okay, so if we spent 80 cents of that dollar, our marginal propensity to consume would be 0.8. Okay. Now, with that dollar that we don't spend, let's say in a simplified example, we save. Okay. So if our marginal propensity to consume is 80%, our marginal propensity to save or not spend would be 20. Because you can only, actually the dot will go there, because you can only save and consume 100% of anything. Okay. But of course, in the real world, there's other things besides consumption and savings. The government gets their hooks into it. So there is what you could call a marginal propensity on the part of the government to tax. Also, if we spend money not on American products, but on foreign products, there is also a marginal propensity to buy imports. Okay. And so the multiplier, all these things are things that we don't consume right now. So the multiplier, the amount that goes, that is not consumed now but goes into the system, the multiplier, if I can spell, equals 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Okay? So the multiplier, if in our example, we had the marginal propensity to consume of 80%, the multiplier would be 1 over 1 minus 0.8. So it would equal 1 over 0.2, which would equal 20. Okay, so in that case, that initial $1 million injection into the system, or $1 billion, could equal $20 billion in total impact. Okay. Now, the problem is, one of the problems is with the multiplier, is that if it works with injections, it works in the same way when you take money out of the system. Say if the money would be, if the government would reduce their spending, the impact would be the nominal reduction times the multiplier. Okay. So it depends on our spending habits and our savings habits, which would depend on the actual impact of fiscal policy. Okay. So now, fiscal policy, then, we see that there's a multiplier, and so that an initial injection into the system can produce a lot more than the initial injection. So everybody's happy and fiscal policy works, right? Once it's all hassled out. Well, it works to a certain extent, but it doesn't work completely. Or as Lee Corso would say, not so fast, my friend. Okay. What limits fiscal policy, besides lags, etc., is what they call crowding. Okay. Now, crowding can be like our navels. They can be either innies or outies. Okay. And crowding, what that means is that it can be crowding in or crowding out. Okay. So, crowding out, let's talk about that first. Crowding out and crowding in general is when a fiscal policy has certain effects by its implementation that produces some results that are totally opposite than what the intention was. Okay? That's what happens. And crowding in, like for instance, an expansionary policy that you wanted to kickstart and move aggregate demand out and everything like that, it produces some things that tends to limit how far aggregate demand moves out. And the opposite, crowding in, is when you have a contractionary policy. The implementation of that contractionary policy tends to limit the effectiveness of it. Let's say an example here. Let's say that the government wants to increase spending on infrastructure, say. Okay, and how does it do that? Well, it will sell bonds. Okay, and lots of times they'll work with T-bills. They're small in face value, about $1,000. They mature within a year, so it's kind of a quick and dirty solution to government funding problems. Okay, so on the bond market, we have the bond price here. We have the demand for bonds and the supply of bonds. Okay, when the government sells T-bills, what they do, they sell them, it puts a lot more on the market, okay? And what happens to the price, the average bond price? It goes down. When the average bond price goes down, what happens to the interest rate? It goes up. So what does the interest rate do to consumption plus net investment plus government? It really doesn't do much to that, but okay. The interest rate going up tends to curtail a little bit consumption, lower investment, and it tends to change the exchange rate. But now its effect on the exchange rate is the crowding out thing. What do we mean by that? Okay, let's say this is the exchange market here. That's the exchange rate, and that's the quantity of dollars on the that are being sold and bought at the market. Okay. Okay. So we have, when the interest rate goes up, we have an original exchange rate here. The interest rate goes up. The demand for dollars goes up because foreign investors will make more money on our investments. Okay, so the exchange rate goes up. The